tracking down threat actors and working with various partners to take action against them.
You are also a member of the Ransomware Task Force. Explain the group's mission and mention maybe some of the other contributing organizations.
Sure. There was, I believe, something like 60 organizations that took part in it. And they were a combination of security companies, hosting providers, telecom providers, law enforcement, and government people all working together with the mission of essentially coming up with a framework for how we can deal with the ransomware problem. Because it's just been getting worse and worse over the past, several years. It's been around a long time, but the past few years have just been accelerating. And so we basically got together. We spent the first part of our time studying the problem, really putting together what are the real issues here to face. And then we put together like a no kidding recommendation for how this problem can be solved. And that was the framework that we ended up coming out with and publishing in that paper at the end of April.
The task force delivered a report, if you will, to the U.S. executive branch on fighting back against ransomware, which is, a no kidding, maybe the no kidding report. But start by describing the who, the where, and how profile of the threat actors.
So you can sort of break down the threat actors who are involved in ransomware into sort of two different groups. They all are motivated by money. They all want to get as much profit as they can. So they are essentially criminal organizations like organized crime, very similar to the traditional organized crime organizations in a lot of ways. But they can kind of be broken down between groups that are operating from countries where we have good law enforcement relationships and countries where we don't. And that's really the separating line between how you deal with actors that come from these two different areas.
The report breaks down its no kidding recommendations into 4 basic steps. Knowing this is a complex topic and we don't want to oversimplify, walk us through these 4 steps.
So the idea was that if you're going to have a campaign against ransomware, you have to really look at it from a holistic perspective. You have to look at options for deterring ransomware actors to begin with. You have to look at options for disrupting threat actors who can't be deterred. And you have to look at the ability to respond to these events when they do happen so that people can recover from these events with as little pain as possible.
The report goes into great detail identifying specific actions and assignees of these actions. One common thread I noticed is that the government is often assigned ownership of an action, but a cyber attack isn't like a kinetic military attack. You can't install a battery of Patriot missiles to eliminate enemy data packets. Doesn't the responsibility for defeating ransomware fall to maybe each of us in our organizations and homes?
I definitely think it's everyone's responsibility, but it's not just for defending against ransomware. But the big thing that I really think was the #1 recommendation out of the ransomware task force was to declare that ransomware is a national security threat. That was the biggest thing that took sort of the part that was missing from this fight. It was able to activate that part. So let me back up a little bit and say that there's been a lot of work that's already been done by the industry to try and defend against ransomware. There's been, really good advice has been published for years about how to set up your network so that you're the least vulnerable. There's lots of security tips, the top 10 things you can do. All of that information has been out there and people have been working really hard to try to work the defensive piece. The piece that was missing was an offensive piece of really targeting the ransomware actors themselves, figuring out who they are, and then working to dismantle those organizations. So we've been putting a lot of effort into defense, but this offensive piece is what was missing. And the reason was that it wasn't given the proper priority within the national framework for the government to actually expend resources against this threat. So by getting it designated a national security threat, that then had this huge trickle-down effect within the government that they were able to resource it properly. And we've seen that effect starting to happen now. It's only been 3 months, and the government has made quite a few steps in implementing these recommendations.
Are smaller organizations and businesses less of a target because of their size and possible reward? Or do ransomware attackers follow the path of least resistance, if you will?
That really depends on the actor you're talking about. Some of them have this philosophy of they're just going to exploit anybody that they can and get as many victims as possible. And they'll even take small ransomware payments because their business model essentially is scale. And then there are other ransomware actors that are only going for the big fish. So they're only going for, really big companies where they know they have cyber insurance and they are very likely to pay. People who have intellectual property that if that is stolen, they can then do a double extortion scheme so that not only do they lock up their network, but they'll also threaten to release their intellectual property on the internet if they don't pay the ransom.
As a national security threat, how is ransomware more than just a financial crime, but maybe even also a crime that puts human life at risk?
Oh, absolutely. So if you look at what ransomware does, it locks up a network so that it cannot operate. And we've seen, over the past few years that there has been some pretty indiscriminate targeting of where that ransomware lands. It's landed in hospitals that has put human lives at risk. It's taken down like city government networks. That also includes things like the 911 system, which also puts lives at risk. There have been cities that had to outsource all of their 911 calls for a rather long period of time to other jurisdictions, so that they could actually continue to have 911 services while they're dealing with ransomware events. So, people are often talking about critical infrastructure, and water supply, power supply. Those are also vulnerable to this type of attack, but people don't really think about how easy it is to take down the 911 system of a city. And if you do that to 2 or 3 cities, you start having major impact because the ability to shift those calls to other places starts to winnow away because there's too many calls that need to be shifted.
Adam, where can we find a copy of the Ransomware Task Force report?
It's on the IST website. So the Institute for Security and Technology, I think it's Institute for Security and Technology.org. They have it posted there for anyone to download.
Adam Flatley, Director of Threat Intelligence at Redacted. Thanks for joining us, Adam. What if somebody wants to follow you? What's the best way they can connect?
I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn, or they could reach out through our company website.
Sounds good. Thanks again for joining us, Adam.
All right. Thank you.
And find and subscribe to more of my interviews right here on all the major podcast platforms under the Tanya Hall Innovation Show or at tanyahall.net. Thanks for watching.
ExpressVPN has become a top competitor in the VPN industry, and for good